Okay, this is chapter 19 of my autobiography. Terry, Chris, then Sandy. Then came Terry. This was one relationship that I asked myself over and over and over again. What in the world was I thinking? Because this relationship was the pits. I grew to hate Terry quickly. She was filthy, nasty, and had no sense of any moral values whatsoever. You had to make her keep clean or take a shower. She would pride herself on being pregnant and having as many babies as she could, and she did. 8 kids total. Wow. And they all grew up not to have any moral values and lived filthy just like mommy. What a concept. Terry Pavey was her maiden name, but she had kids by McKinney, Shaw, me, and Dennis Fry, of course, with whom she married once, divorced, then remarried. My relationship with Terry was short lived, thank God. When we first started seeing each other, I was introduced through her brother Alan Pavey. I think Willie and Alan had said something to the effect of, "That woman standing over there says she thinks you're good looking." And I said, "Oh yeah? I'll ask her." Then one thing led to another and we kissed, then we got together. Then it wasn't too long after that we lived together with Willie and Beth over on Tacoma Street at 340 North Tacoma. My assumption was that since Terry had already had 5 kids at the time, Michelle, Dora, John, Theodora, and Candace, why in the world would she want any more? It would seem to me that she would have got fixed after that to where she couldn't get pregnant again. But oh no, not Terry. Not only that, but she didn't warn or tell me ahead of time that she could still get pregnant. And really, I didn't want any more kids at the time, being still fresh from going through my divorce from Sharon. It was a shock to me when Terry came home from the doctor one day and made her announcement after just telling me 2 days before that she had been seeing her ex-husband Dennis for about 2 months off and on and had been having sex with him. Naturally, I was skeptical as to whether or not the baby that she was carrying was mine, and I feel today I had every right to be. Sure, it ended up being mine through DNA tests and all that, and today Terry still denies ever telling me that her and Dennis had messed around while her and I were together, which is a bold-faced lie on her part. Dennis and I didn't get along for the longest time. Dennis had a big habit, and still does, of talking behind a person's back and talking about how tough he was, but when he was confronted about his actions, he'd melt like butter and would deny everything. When the baby was born, the baby was a girl, and Terry, through the help of another man that Terry slept with, I never knew his real name, but Terry called him Pops, came up with the idea of naming the baby Athena. I took no part in helping Terry name the baby at the time because Terry and I were not speaking to each other. And the reason for this was because I stayed away because Dennis and I were not getting along. And I felt that if I did come around, Dennis and I wouldn't have ended up fighting. When the baby was born, the baby was named Athena May Hayes Pavey. I could see the Athena May, but why 2 middle names? I thought it was stupid and ridiculous on her part. It just didn't make any sense to me. What was she thinking? Terry and I ended up breaking up before the baby was born, and I had already started seeing someone else and didn't find out about the baby until one day several months later I received a call one morning after being drunk the night before. Willie was trying to get a hold of me to tell me about Terry and had said that Terry wanted me to get a hold of her. So I got a hold of the hospital and got her room number and had called her. When I talked to her on the phone, she told me about the baby and had said that if I chose not to be a part of the baby's life, that she wouldn't bother me. but insisted that the baby was mine and that if I ever wanted a DNA test to prove it, she'd go with me to do it. First of all, I wish I'd stayed drunk. Second of all, I wish I would have taken her advice and never been a part of the baby's life and would have just left that mess alone. Because nothing prepared me for the things to come as I'm getting ready to explain. For the first 3 to 4 years of the baby's life, I had chosen not to be a part of it because Terry knew that Dennis and I didn't get along. There were a couple of times that Dennis and I had gotten into arguments and I had almost fought. Dennis loved to talk behind a person's back. Oh, he loved to backstab a person. He couldn't be trusted. What Dennis needed was a royal ass stomping to straighten him out, and I wish I would have given it to him long before 2005. He needed it. He was also a cop caller, and even though he caused the trouble, if you did anything to him, he was quick to run to the cops over it. I couldn't stand him. Still can't. I did what I could to tolerate and get along with Dennis Fry because I knew if I didn't, Terry wouldn't allow me to see the baby. But Dennis enjoyed causing trouble, and he also got away with molesting Terry's daughters. Terry's daughters had told a few people about Dennis, and about Dennis was teaching them how to have sex, but every time the information got brought up with Terry in the past, Terry would brush it off and not believe it. Dennis at one time had been arrested over child molestation, but it had been thrown out of court due to the fact that witnesses were too scared of Dennis to testify against him. So naturally, his sorry ass got away with it. I didn't finally see Athena until she was about 4 years old, and Terry had already told her that I was her father. Here's an update. I later found out that Dennis had died, and I sent word to several people hoping that it would get back to Terry that I felt that Dennis couldn't have died soon enough. I felt like that he was worthless. It was a poor excuse for a human being. And Terry's brother had also told me that Terry had caught Dennis and my daughter in bed together having sex, but didn't do a thing about it. More about this issue later. The first time Athena saw me, she was 4 years old. She says, "You're my daddy. Mommy told me who you are. Can I sit on your lap and give you a hug?" I said, "Sure." Athena gave me a kiss on the cheek and I gave her a big hug. After that, I saw Athena whenever I had time to do so. I had agreed to get along with Dennis even though my gut told me not to. That was Terry's drill from the very beginning. I hated Dennis and wanted to tear his head off. But also little did I realize what lay in store for me and the secret plans that were made behind my back. Terry had somehow got a hold of Sharon, my first wife, and had talked to Sharon and Starla. Sharon was out to make me pay for leaving and divorce her. So Sharon used every lie and trick in the book to get back at me with the help of her mother, of course. Without really knowing the truth from my side of the family, and I know Sharon didn't tell Terry the truth about trying to set my brother Gene up. If Terry would have just asked my mother how bad Sharon was, my mother could have cleared the whole thing up. But Terry chose to believe Sharon and everything she had to say. And it wouldn't surprise me if Terry hadn't somewhere along the line met Ed Shackle. It took me years to figure it out, and also having my life destroyed before my very eyes before I finally stopped and took a good hard look and realized why I was having so many problems when all I wanted was to be left alone. Ed Shackle is a snake, and I know beyond question that he was behind a lot of shit that took place. That's why I can't stand the son of a bitch. He's straight up evil. Terry had invited me to birthday parties, picnics, and cookouts. But I didn't realize that behind the scenes, Terry had plans for me to hurt me in the long run. When Terry and I had split up, we went our separate ways before Athena was born. I dated a drunk named Christina James. When I first met her, it was through a dateline. Jason Manuel talked to her a couple of times on the phone, and so did I. My biggest mistake was ever meeting her because she was trouble and needed serious help. Everything seemed fine at first, but then she drank and the arguments would start. I wish when I left her the first time I would have stayed gone. She was nuts. She would hide vodka bottles, gin and beer bottles all over the house or apartment, down the register, in the toilet bowl, in the closet, in the windowsill, inside the glass covering of a ceiling fan, underneath the sink, behind the plates and bowls in the kitchen cabinet. When I went to break up with her the first time and went back to my grandparents' house, Chris would call and beg me to come back. What I didn't see was the fact that when Chris would do this, she was actually wanting me to come back and fight with her some more. I worked for a pickup and delivery company called Cycle Dispatch and Delivery. I would work 16 hours a day and had to eat on the road. I would travel all over the state of Indiana and parts of Ohio, Illinois, and Kentucky. I loved that job because I loved to travel, and if I ever got the chance to do it again, I would. I really enjoy it. What I didn't enjoy was coming back home after 16 hours and being exhausted to find Chris drinking again and ready to fight and argue. I'm not sure why I stayed with her for 2 years. I know I could have found better. Things got so bad that I started drinking to go to sleep at night so I wouldn't have to put up with her. I grew to dislike her quickly. What I didn't understand was her family knew about her problem, but if anyone would say anything or suggest that she get help, they were quick to defend her. If I would have left and just stayed gone, I'd been better off. She was totally out of control. I was with Chris on the morning that I got a phone call um, to call TERRI when Athena was born. I was still in bed asleep. Speeding up to a year later in 1993, my cousin Clyde McPeak Jr. had been in a fire and burned up most of his body and was in the burn unit at Wishart Hospital for several months. A lot of people thought that he wouldn't make it. The doctors had to do several skin grafts to repair the damage. I thought of him and I thought of me. My dad had came and told me about my cousin, and I went out to the hospital with my dad to be there for moral support. While I was out at the hospital for about an hour with my dad, Clyde Sr. and Sally, my grandmother Lillian, and an unknown woman was walking with her. That unknown young woman was Sandy. At the time, I didn't know who she was. Then my dad told me that Sandy was Clyde Sr.'s daughter and that Sandy was my first cousin. We were introduced and said our highs and byes. I don't quite remember how she got my phone number, but she had called and I had came by the house where she was living and would pick her up and drive her to the hospital to see Clyde Jr. I had the opportunity to meet Sandy's boyfriend. His name was Bear, but his real name was Dennis Lee Hardy. And I guess Sandy played him just like she was getting ready to play me. The sad thing was I didn't see it at the time. My dad had warned me about Sandy and her two sisters, Valerie and Berdina, also known as Dee Dee, and how well they enjoyed playing men to get what they want and then dumping them. Sandy didn't know how to read and write very well, but she sure knew how to play the game. She played the game well, I must admit. Anyway, getting back to Chris, during this time, she had lived at Thompson Village at Meridian and Thompson Road. Chris and I had gotten into several arguments due to Chris drinking. She almost had me arrested, and this Marion County sheriff, who was also back and forth through Greenwood, named Ed Bradley, had me up against the wall in the hallway with a gun stuck to the back of my head and had threatened me he was going to shoot me if I made a move. He didn't want to hear my side of what caused the argument. I thought he was a snotty bastard. I didn't like him. I was out to get even with him, and I did eventually. This idiot made sure he was out to cause a scene in the apartment hallway where Chris and I were at the time. Through all of Chris's stupidity, she was eventually evicted from Thompson Village. But before this, when Ed Bradley finally let me go, I went back into the apartment. Chris had finally decided to calm down, and she eventually fell asleep, thank God. So I stayed up for a little while, then I fell asleep. The next day I got up and left and went to my grandparents' house. I had to get away and breathe for a while. Don't ask me why I did this, because I still to this day don't know why I felt sorry for the psychopathic, uncontrollable whatever she was. But I gave in to talking to my grandmother and to allowing her to stay on the half of the double on 2525 side on Prospect Street. Big mistake. But after Chris was evicted from Thompson Village, I felt sorry for her because she laid on such a sob story about not having a place to live. So there we were at 2525 Prospect and me working 16 hours a day at cycle dispatch and delivery. When Chris moved out of Thompson Village, I had Willie and Alan help me move her. From the stupidity of Chris getting drunk all the time and throwing things and hiding liquor bottles all over the apartment, the management at Thompson Village had all the damages that Chris left behind in that apartment and took Chris to court and won. And of course, that gave Chris another excuse to drink some more after she walked out of the courtroom. I made one last trip over to Thompson Village on my day off from work. I was out to get even with that fucking crooked cop, Ed Bradley, and I did. I took a key down both the driver and passenger side of the sheriff's car and scratched up the paint job. I took broken toothpicks with super glue and stuck them in his door locks where he couldn't use his key to unlock his car. And I loosened the valve stems of his tires, all at 4:30 in the morning. Sure, I admit I probably shouldn't have done that, but what gave Bradley the right to put a gun in the back of my head? This was between 1992 and 1993. I was unarmed, and where was the law to protect me? And downtown Indianapolis is so crooked when it comes to law enforcement, and I know if I would have been wasting my time reporting this scumbag to the authorities because they all run together. It's a fact. If Bradley hadn't had his gun on him at the time, I probably would have beat his ass in the hallway of that apartment building. I would not have gave him the chance to whip out his academy training if he had any training at all. He wasn't shit without his gun, and he knew it. At the time he put the gun to the back of my head, he was plain clothes, no uniform, and off duty. Where does this idiot have the right to pull a gun on me? All because I got into an argument with an out-of-control drunk. I had a theory for years after this incident that Chris at one time had slept with Ed Bradley, and that the whole scenario of Ed Bradley showing up in that hallway of the apartment building was a setup between he and Chris. I have always thought that because it's awful funny, Chris always seemed to know just about everyone on the south side of Indy near Southport and Greenwood. And that also probably explains the deformity she has of one side of her upper lip overlapping the bottom like a duck. And it's not so much of whom she knows, but who she blows. But getting back to the autobiography. There Chris and I were on Prospect Street, and I don't know why, but I always hoped that things would have got better, but they didn't. One night I didn't get home from working with cycle dispatch and delivery until around 11 o'clock. I went to unlock the front door and the door was already unlocked. Chris had somehow met some other drunk who was older than me, but in reality, Chris was 20 years older than I was anyway, but I was quiet and all I wanted to do was relax from a hard day's work on the road when I heard talking upstairs. And we didn't have a phone upstairs. So, who was Chris talking to? And naked. This fucking bum she picked up. I had a ball bat standing in the corner of the dining room, and I picked it up, and I slowly walked up the stairs and tried hard not to make any noise. I got to the top of the stairs and stood quiet. This drunk was sitting on my side of the bed naked with his back facing the doorway. Chris didn't have any clothes on either, but was under a blanket. I yelled out as loud as I could, "What the fuck are you doing in my grandmother's house?" He said, "What's it to you?" When he said that, I quickly hit him in the face with the ball bat and hit him in the arm where he couldn't swing on me. Then I grabbed him up under his armpit and lifted his naked body up off the floor and shoved him through the doorway and kicked his legs out from under him, and he slid down the stairs on his back. I chased him to the bottom of the landing, picked him up again, and shoved him off the stairs onto the couch that was by the stairs in the dining room. I told him to get out. He said, "What about my clothes?" So I went upstairs and got his clothes. $10 worth of quarters fell out of his pocket. But anyway, I threw his clothes at him. He got dressed, and I followed him and kicked him off the front porch. He laid on the sidewalk. I picked him up and told him to get on down the street and get on down the road and don't come back. He didn't. I went back in the house, went upstairs. I went back into the house and up the stairs I went. I went into the bedroom and Chris was hiding underneath the blanket. I yanked the blanket off of her and screamed at her and said, "You ain't worth it." I took most of my clothes and personal belongings and the $10 and quarters off the floor and went next door to my grandmother's, and I slept in my old bedroom upstairs for the night. I was not only angry, I was hurt. The next morning I got up and got ready for work. Chris came over and my grandmother let her in. She came upstairs and knocked on the bedroom door. I told her that I was in a hurry and had to get to work. She said that when I got home, she wanted to talk to me. I opened the bedroom door and told her that there was nothing to talk about. So I went downstairs and out the door to warm up the van because every morning I have to take the van in to work to have routine maintenance done before going on the road. 76 was my number on the radio. While I was out warming the van, Chris comes out to the van and gets in on the passenger side. She asked, "Will you please come over and talk to me when you get home from work?" I said, "Yes, as long as you don't sneak guys in the house while I'm gone, and as long as you're not drunk when I get here." For the first time ever, Chris is sober when I got home, and she apologizes. And dumbass me decides to stay, but I also told Chris that I have a lot to worry about with my cousin just getting burned up, and that I would be going back and forth to the hospital for moral support until I'm sure he's okay. So I left and went out to the hospital for a couple hours. While I was out there, Sandy was there. Sandy needed a ride home, so when it was time to leave, I took her home. I gave her my grandmother's number in case she needed a ride back to the hospital. About 2 days later, I get a call. Sandy needed a ride. Sandy told me that when I came over to just knock and come on in. So I did. While I was there, she had tears in her eyes and had been asking me questions about what I knew about what happened to Clyde Jr. I told her that Clyde Jr. was putting gasoline in a car from a gas can and lit a cigarette and set himself on fire. Sandy said that that was the story she got, but said that she felt that there was more to it than what she had heard, or I heard. I told her there was, but if I told her, she needed to keep her mouth shut. I told Sandy about Clyde Jr. and his girlfriend Rhonda at the time getting into an argument. Rhonda had a son from Clyde Jr. and had threatened that she wouldn't let Clyde Jr. see his son. And there was probably more to it that I didn't know about. But Clyde Jr. gets upset, drunk, goes outside, takes the gas cans, pours it all over himself, and sets himself on fire. Sandy said, "I knew it, but I told Sandy that I'll catch hell if she said anything to anyone that I told her the truth." She starts to cry, so I put my arms around her to hug her and comfort her. Then I leaned down to have her rest her head on my shoulder. I went to kiss her on the cheek, and she quickly moved her face around and started French kissing me. I went to pull away, and she grabbed me and said, "Don't you dare." I said, "What if Bear finds out? He's a big man. I don't think I want to piss him off." Sandy told me not to worry about it. All the way out to the hospital, I was shocked. We stayed for a couple of hours and left. On the way to taking Sandy home, Sandy asked me, "Are you in a big hurry to go back home right now?" I said, "No, what did you have in mind?" She said, "I'd like to go somewhere where you and I can have a talk alone, where we are not around a bunch of people." I said, "Okay, I know a dead-end street over by the house that has a bunch of abandoned houses that we could park, shut the vehicle off, and talk a while." She said, "Okay." We went to the location. It was pouring down rain that night. The vehicle was parked and off. The windows were steamed up, so I said, "What do you want to talk about?" She said, "This." Then she pulled me over to her and we kissed again. Then she got in my lap and said, "I've been wanting you for a long time." I told her that it was getting late and that I had to work the next morning. Plus, I had to make sure Chris didn't wreck the house or have any guys there, and Chris was still wanting to talk to me. So I ended up dropping Sandy off at home, and then I went home. One of the things that I normally did when I arrived home from work was to go next door first and check on Grandma. That was always top priority. Chris knew this, but she always bitched at me anyway for either showing up late or because I wasn't right under her wing for her to control or to argue 24/7. The shit got old and we were near the end of our relationship. I couldn't take it anymore. And there was one night that Chris was drunk on vodka and we got into an argument. Chris started screaming at my grandmother. Chris started screaming. My grandmother got scared, and when she heard it, she called the police. Correction. Sorry about that. Before the police arrived, Chris had threw a tantrum and threw herself face first into the middle of the living room floor, and her nose was bleeding. I spent the night in jail because of that and had to go to court over a former charge of domestic battery. Of course, it was dropped, and yes, my grandmother had bailed me out of jail before I went to court. When I got out of jail, the old White Castle that was still around and located on Virginia Avenue right before you get to the overpass going to the jail. I called Chris with the only 50 cents I had in my pocket at the time and told Chris where I was and how to get to where the White Castle was located. What I didn't realize was Chris acted straight on the phone, but when she crossed the intersection of Virginia Avenue, Fletcher, East, and South Street, I noticed she was weaving back and forth in the road. I thought, oh no, here we go again. She was drunk again. She swerved and almost hit a pickup truck coming out of the driveway of the White Castle. I thought to myself, I'd been saved for staying in lockup. I was hating this. The guy in the pickup truck cusses at Chris. I couldn't blame him. For once, someone saw my side of what was really going on. When Chris's car came to a halt, I insisted on driving home. She started screaming at me, saying, "This is my car." I told her politely, "Okay, Chris, you go drive your car. I'll walk home," and I started walking. When I did this, she starts her car and proceeds to come after me. I told her to go on and leave me alone. Then she pulls the car over, gets out, and throws the keys at me and says, "Come on, I'll let you drive." So, instead of causing any more embarrassing scene than what had already been caused, I gave in to driving the car home. Huge mistake. On the way home, the car is moving, and I have vehicles behind me. When Chris decides to take both hands, grabs the right side of the steering wheel, she has her foot up on the steering column and she's locking her arms to keep the steering wheel from moving. I quickly put on the brakes, almost get plowed in the ass from the vehicle behind me, and I threw it in park, shut the car off, and got out and said, "You guys handle this drunk. I'm out of here." I took off walking. I played it smart this time. I ducked down side streets, went up some alleys, and I always kept a watch out for her. There was no way I was going back to that car. Believe it or not, I got home before she did. I had to hurry. I quickly grabbed everything that was important, electronics, writings, most of my clothes, and took them next door on my grandmother's side of the double 2527 Prospect. I only left a handful of clothes on the 2525 side just in case Chris had decided to destroy something of mine. I quickly explained to my grandmother what was going on and why I walked home and what happened and why I went to jail over this shit with Chris. But I also explained that I was going to have to somehow make Chris get me out of this. I stayed the night again on the 2527 side, Grandma's side of the house. The next morning, here comes Chris again to knock on the door and wake me up. Luckily, the arrest didn't cause me to lose my job. I answered the bedroom door and asked Chris if she was drunk, like she was really going to tell me the truth. And I also stated that if she was drunk, that I would only talk to her when she sobered up. She assured me that she had just woke up and that she had wanted to talk to me before I went to work. I explained to Chris that I had already been informed from the courts upon release that they would be sending Chris a paper to show up for court. But I explained to Chris that unless it's a warrant, that Chris wouldn't have to show up, and they could serve subpoenas all day long, and there have been cases where they would send a subpoena to someone, and if that person would fail to show up for court, they'd throw it out. I also told Chris that I had insisted that she just stay home on the day I went to court. But Chris insisted on going, and that if they called her name, she wouldn't say anything, and that she would pretend that she wasn't there. I said, "No, Chris, please, just stay home." She didn't, though. Court came. On the way there, I told Chris not to drink. I also told her that if she so much as peeped when her name was called, I'd break her neck right there in that courtroom. I told her that she got me into this mess and she was getting me out of it. After all the shit that she put me through, I felt like I had nothing to lose. My life was already a wreck to begin with, and the courts would be doing me a huge favor by giving me lethal injection. I was to the point of exhaustion. I was to the point of exhaustion being with Chris. All this stuff that she was doing was totally unnecessary, and I was too much of a nice guy and fell for it. I'm going to continue this in a part 2 of chapter 19.